People kept calling him a good man, a pillar of the community, a devoted husband. I stood beside the casket, hands clasped so tightly my nails dug into my palms. Everyone spoke softly, as if kindness could erase the truth. I nodded, smiled when someone touched my arm, and whispered thank you. Inside, I felt nothing. No grief, no rage, just the hollow quiet that comes when fear finally runs out of places to hide. Henry Carter, principal, model citizen. To them, he was light. To me, he was a locked door. 40 years of being corrected, hushed, inspected. 40 years of his rules disguised as care. He never hit me where it showed, never shouted where anyone could hear. But every bruise beneath my sleeves had its twin inside me. And now, as they lowered him into the ground, I realized something. This was the first day of my life I didn't have to ask permission to breathe. The first few months were quiet, almost tender in their simplicity. I kept the house spotless, learned his favorite meals. When I married Henry at 23, I didn't expect fireworks. I wanted peace. After a childhood in a small house where my father drank and my mother prayed too loudly, I thought calmness was love. Henry seemed calm, respectable, safe. He was 34, already a school principal, and carried himself like a man who always knew the right thing to do. When he asked me to marry him, he didn't use the word love once. He said, "You'll never have to worry about anything again." And I believed that was enough. Our wedding was modest, a church ceremony with lemonade and pie in the fellowship hall afterward. My mother cried, saying, "You're lucky, Helen. You caught a steady man." Steady. That word followed me for the next 40 years like a prayer that turned into a curse. By heart, pot roast on Sundays, chicken casserole on Wednesdays, and exactly 1 spoon of sugar in his tea. He said little, but when he did, it was usually to correct something small. The way I folded the towels, the time dinner was served, the volume of the radio. I told myself it was normal, that all marriages took adjustment. At night, he would read the newspaper while I sat nearby, sewing or pretending to watch television. He rarely looked up. When he did, it was with the distant politeness you give a stranger on a bus. But when he touched my shoulder in passing, I convinced myself it meant something, that under all that order, affection was waiting its turn. Our first Christmas together, I bought him a new wristwatch. He opened it, studied it, and said, "You should have asked. I prefer leather bands." Then he set it aside and went back to his meal. I laughed it off, embarrassed, and told myself I'd do better next year. That became a pattern, me trying to do better, him setting new invisible standards I could never quite reach. When friends asked how married life was, I smiled and said, "Wonderful. He takes care of me." It wasn't a lie exactly, he did take care of things, bills, repairs, decisions. I just didn't realize until much later that being taken care of meant being managed. We bought a small brick house on the edge of town, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a neat yard with trimmed hedges. I loved it instantly, the way newlyweds are supposed to. Henry called it efficient. That word, like him, was practical, emotionless. People admired him. He was generous with his time, good with words. They'd tell me, "You're blessed to have such a devoted husband." And I'd smile, nodding, while a small ache twisted inside me. They saw the man he showed them, a gentleman with pressed shirts and perfect manners. I saw the man who corrected how I held a fork, who decided which friends I should keep, who said a wife's duty was to make her husband proud, not happy. We didn't have children right away. Henry said we'd wait until the time was right. I didn't argue. By then, I had learned that silence kept the peace. When our son, Evan, finally came along 8 years later, I thought things would soften. I imagined Henry holding him, smiling the way fathers do in movies. Instead, he treated fatherhood like another responsibility to be checked off the list. Still, I told myself things were fine. I told myself that steadiness was better than chaos, that a quiet house was a safe one. I kept the curtains washed, the floors shining, the meals hot. I became the kind of wife people pointed to as an example of devotion. Inside, I was shrinking, slowly, politely, invisibly. Sometimes, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her smile looked practiced, her eyes cautious. Once, when I was dusting Henry's bookshelf, I found an old photo of myself from before the wedding, laughing, hair loose, holding a paintbrush. I had forgotten that version of me existed. When Henry came home and saw the photo on the table, he frowned. You shouldn't leave things lying around. It makes the place look messy. I put it away and never took it out again. The years blurred together in quiet repetition, laundry on Mondays, groceries on Thursdays. There were no fights, not really. Just corrections, small and constant, until I stopped needing to be told. I started anticipating what he wanted before he spoke. It made life easier. It also erased me. Sometimes at night, when Henry was asleep, I'd stand by the window and look out at the dark street, wondering what would happen if I just kept walking. But I never did. I'd tell myself, you have a good life. A roof, a husband, respect. And then I'd turn off the light and climb back into bed beside him, careful not to wake the man everyone called kind. Now, looking back, I see how I mistook control for love, silence for peace, and obedience for safety. I wasn't a wife. I was a reflection of what he wanted the world to see. And by the time I realized it, that reflection was all that was left of me. It started in ways so small I almost didn't notice. A sigh when I forgot to refill his water glass. A sharp look when I interrupted the evening news. A slammed door because the soup was too salty. I told myself it was stress from work. Being a principal couldn't be easy, I reasoned. People respected him, he carried the weight of their expectations. Maybe I just needed to be more understanding. That was how I explained away the tension, the way he'd go quiet for hours, the way he'd move things slightly out of place, waiting for me to notice and apologize for touching them in the first place. But control has a way of growing like mold in the corners of a house. It spreads quietly, until one day the air itself feels spoiled. The first real warning came on a Wednesday. I remember because it was meatloaf night, and Henry liked routine. The phone rang while I was in the kitchen. It was my sister, Marjorie, calling to check in. We hadn't talked in weeks. I laughed at something she said, something silly about our old neighbor and her yappy dog, and Henry appeared in the doorway. He didn't say a word, just watched. His face didn't move, but his eyes had gone flat. When I hung up, he asked, "What was so funny?" "Just Marjorie," I said lightly. "She was telling me." He cut me off. "I don't recall giving you permission to waste half an hour gossiping when dinner isn't on the table." I froze. He'd never used that tone before, cold, deliberate. Like a teacher reprimanding a child. I said quietly, "It's 5 minutes past 6. Dinner's ready now." He sat down, ate in silence, and later that night, without another word, disconnected the phone from the wall. After that, small things began disappearing. The radio I used in the kitchen, the house key I kept in my purse, the mirror from the guest room. When I asked, he'd say, "You don't need that," or "I moved it where it belongs." Every protest was met with a lecture about gratitude. "You don't realize how lucky you are," he'd say. "Some men wouldn't tolerate half of what I do." At first, I thought I could fix it. I made his favorite meals more often. I spoke softer, smiled more. I waited for the version of him everyone else saw, the charming man who shook hands firmly, who helped widows carry groceries to their cars. But that man only existed in public. Behind closed doors, I walked on eggshells. I learned the rhythm of his moods. Quick steps in the hallway meant I should stay out of sight. The slower, measured ones meant he was thinking, planning how to make me feel small again. The night it happened for the first time, I remember everything. I thought maybe, just maybe, things were changing. When we got home, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, which was rare for him. I made tea and turned on the record player, soft jazz, barely audible. For a few minutes, it felt almost like a normal marriage. Then, as I carried the teacup into the living room, he said, "You embarrassed me today." I stopped. "At school?" "Yes," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. Laughing like a schoolgirl with the women afterward. "Everyone saw you. The principal's wife shouldn't draw attention." I blinked, confused. "We were just talking about the bake sale." He stood up, setting his glass down so hard the amber liquid spilled. "Don't argue with me." "I wasn't," I said, trying to sound calm. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "I'm sorry if." That was when it happened. A sudden, sharp crack across my cheek. So quick, my brain couldn't keep up. For a moment, I thought maybe something had fallen, that I'd bumped into a shelf. But then I felt the heat blooming under my skin. He didn't shout. He didn't look angry. His expression was almost bored. "Now," he said, adjusting his shirt cuffs, "maybe you'll think before you make a fool of yourself." He walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the living room, one hand on my face, my teacup shattered on the floor. I waited for the tears to come, but they didn't. I just stood there, staring at the shards, listening to the faint hum of the record player. It was playing Ella Fitzgerald, Someone to Watch Over Me. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I finally went to bed, he was already asleep, his breathing deep and even. I lay beside him, wide awake, tracing the faint outline of the bruise forming near my jaw. I told myself it was a mistake, that everyone loses control once. That marriage meant forgiveness. By morning, I had half convinced myself it hadn't even been that bad. Then I went to the kitchen. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a cross, was a note written in his neat handwriting. Greater than breakfast at 7. Don't make it late again. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just instruction. That was when something in me cracked. Not the way a bone breaks, but the way glass does when heat meets cold. A silent fracture that spread slowly but never heals right. For the next few days, I told no one. I wore my hair loose to hide the bruise. The other women smiled and said how lucky I was to have such a devoted husband. I smiled back and said, "Yes, I am." That night, when he reached for my hand, I flinched. He didn't notice, or maybe he did and enjoyed it. It would be easy to say that was the moment I knew who he truly was. But the truth is, I already knew. I'd known for years, in the quiet corrections, in the small humiliations, in the way my voice had grown smaller every season. The slap wasn't the beginning. It was just the first time he stopped pretending. And me? I pretended even harder. Because that's what women like me were taught to do. To keep the peace. To keep the home. To keep breathing, even when the air hurt to inhale. Over the years, I learned that silence could be armor. The quieter I was, the safer the air around me became. I could tell what kind of night it would be just by the sound of Henry's car pulling into the driveway. The slam of the door meant irritation. The pause before it shut meant calculation. He didn't need to raise his hand often after that first time. Words and silence did most of the damage. He had a gift for saying things that didn't sound cruel until you carried them around long enough for them to sink in. You talk too much for someone who doesn't have much to say. You'd be happier if you stopped thinking so hard. You should be grateful you don't have to work like other women. He forbade me from taking a job, calling it a man's responsibility to provide. A wife's place is inside at home, he liked to say, as if my confinement were holy. So I stayed home. I kept things neat. I cooked and smiled for the neighbors. People admired how disciplined our household was. They didn't see the quiet inspections, the way he'd check the dust on the windowsills or measure the detergent level in the laundry bottle to make sure I hadn't been wasteful. I used to hum while cleaning. One day he told me it sounded childish. I stopped humming. That's how it went, little by little, trimming myself down to fit the life he built around me. When I got pregnant, I thought maybe everything would change. I imagined him holding the baby, softened by the sight of new life. I pictured us smiling in the hospital, a family like other families. For a brief moment, when Evan was born and Henry looked at him, I thought I saw it, a flicker of gentleness. But it faded by the time we left the hospital. "Don't spoil him," he said on the first night home, as I rocked our newborn son. Boys need discipline early. Evan cried a lot that first year, as babies do. Each time, Henry would sigh loudly or shake his head. "You're making him weak," he'd say if I picked him up too quickly. If I didn't, he'd say I was neglecting my duty. There was no winning, only survival. Still, I loved that child fiercely. His laugh was the only sound that ever made the house feel alive. I would wait for Henry to leave for work and then let Evan babble and play freely. We'd sing silly songs, build towers out of cereal boxes, pretend the living room rug was an island. Those hours were my secret rebellion, the only time I felt like myself. But Henry always found ways to intrude, even from a distance. He'd call during the day to check in. I'd have to answer on the first ring. If I didn't, there would be questions. If I went to the grocery store, he'd check the mileage on my car when I got back. If I stayed out too long, he'd demand to see the receipt and count the items. "You've been gone 47 minutes, he once said. "It doesn't take that long to buy milk." When Evan turned 5, I suggested we enroll him in a local preschool so he could be around other children. Henry's response was simple: "We don't need outsiders teaching him their nonsense." He taught Evan discipline instead. "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," were the only acceptable answers in our house. By the time Evan was 7, he'd stopped laughing so loudly. He learned my habits too. The way I froze when the front door opened, how I smoothed my hair before speaking, how I smiled when I was scared. Sometimes, when Henry wasn't looking, Evan would reach for my hand under the table. Just a small squeeze, a silent question: "Are you okay, Mom?" I'd squeeze back once, my own quiet answer: "Yes." For now. The years blended into routines that felt like rituals, meals at exact times, chores inspected like military drills, conversations that never strayed from approved topics. I didn't notice the slow fading of my friendships until one day I realized I had no one left to call. It always started the same way: a small disagreement with one of my friends, something ordinary. Then Henry would twist it. "She talks too much about her husband's success," he'd say. "She doesn't respect our privacy." Within weeks, he'd find a reason she wasn't welcome anymore. "It's for your own good," he'd insist. People like that put ideas in your head. And I would nod, pretending I agreed, because resistance was exhausting. Once, when Evan was in middle school, I went to a parent meeting alone because Henry was working late. I laughed at a joke another mother made while we waited for the teacher. It felt so foreign, laughing freely, being part of something normal, that I didn't notice Henry standing in the doorway. He had come after all. That night, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just said, "I saw you." Those 3 words froze the blood in my veins. He didn't explain what he meant. He didn't have to. The next day, he canceled the car insurance, to save money, which meant I couldn't drive without his permission. That's how control works. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it just erases your options until the only freedom left is inside your own head. When Evan left for college, the house went unbearably quiet. I thought I would miss my son. I didn't expect to miss the noise, the sound of another heartbeat, another soul moving through the rooms. Without him, there was no buffer between me and Henry. He seemed almost irritated that Evan had gone, as if my motherhood had been useful only while it served his image. "Now you'll have more time for your duties here," he said, as though I'd been neglecting them. I started talking to myself in whispers when he wasn't home, just to hear a voice that wasn't his. I'd look at my reflection sometimes and try to remember who I had been before him. A girl who liked to draw, who loved to dance barefoot in the kitchen, who dreamed of teaching art. That girl was gone, smothered by years of correction, reshaped into the quiet shadow Henry wanted. By the time Evan graduated, I no longer knew what kind of person I was. I knew how to make the perfect roast, how to polish silver until it gleamed, how to sense danger in the pause between Henry's breaths. But I didn't know what I liked, what I feared, what I wanted. I had become an expert in silence. And silence, I had learned, is a language all its own, one that leaves no marks but still bruises deep. When Henry died, it wasn't dramatic. No final words, no long goodbye. Just a sudden collapse during a community board meeting. They said one moment he was speaking about the school renovation, and the next, he was gone. Instant cardiac arrest. The doctor called it peaceful. I thought that was an interesting word for something that left such a mess behind. The house filled with flowers and pity. Neighbors dropped off casseroles, pound cakes, cards. I said, "Thank you," more times in those 2 weeks than I had in the last 10 years of our marriage. People called him a pillar of the community, a mentor. At the funeral, Evan gave a eulogy that made the congregation weep. "My father lived for others," he said, his voice trembling. I stood beside him, nodding, because what else could I do? No one wanted to hear that living for others had meant taking life from one person in particular, me. In the weeks that followed, I wandered the house like a stranger. Every object felt heavy with his presence: the clock that always chimed too loudly, the books arranged in precise order, the faint smell of his cologne clinging to the curtains. I didn't cry, not once. I tried to, but the tears wouldn't come. Grief requires love, and what I felt was something else entirely. Relief, maybe. But relief comes slowly to people who've forgotten what freedom feels like. 3 weeks after the funeral, I began sorting through his things. The study was last on my list. That room had always been off limits to me. He called it his sanctuary. I used to dust only what I could reach from the doorway, never crossing the invisible line. Now, for the first time, I stepped inside. It smelled of leather and dust. The blinds were half closed, the light thin and gray. His desk stood perfectly tidy, pens aligned, papers stacked, nothing out of place. Even in death, the man had order. I started with the drawers. Most held predictable things, old bills. Then I reached the bottom one. It didn't budge, locked. Something in my chest tightened. I searched the room until I found a small brass key taped under a drawer in the file cabinet. Of course it was. Henry always hid things where he thought no one would look. The lock turned with a soft click. Inside was a stack of cassettes, each labeled neatly in his handwriting. Helen, March 1998. Helen, August 2003. Helen, September 2009, *. There were at least a dozen of them, arranged by date. Beneath them, a small black tape recorder. For a moment, I just stared, my heart pounding. Then I pressed play. The sound that came out was my voice. Not my voice as I knew it, but something smaller, trembling, desperate. "Henry, please, I didn't mean." Then his voice, calm and cold. "You never mean it, Helen." That's the problem. A pause. Then the unmistakable sound of me crying. My knees went weak. I sat down on the floor, clutching the recorder like it might bite. I pressed stop, then play again. Another tape. My voice again. Begging. Apologizing for something I couldn't even remember. His replies were measured, clinical, like a man documenting a lab experiment. "Do you hear yourself?" he said on one of them. "This is why no one would believe you if you ever tried to make me look bad." That sentence made the room tilt. My stomach turned. He hadn't made these recordings to remember our life. He'd made them to preserve his version of it. Evidence, in case I ever dared to speak. Proof that I was, in his words, unstable. I listened to one more, the one dated 6 months before his death. My voice sounded older, flatter. I wasn't crying anymore, just silent as he lectured. "See," he said, "nothing to say. That's what guilt looks like." I stopped the tape and sat there for a long time. The walls felt smaller somehow, the air heavy. It was as if even in death, he had found a way to trap me, to make me hear the things I'd worked so hard to forget. My hands started shaking. I picked up one cassette, then another. My name on every single one. I imagined him sitting at that very desk after every argument, rewinding, labeling, cataloging my pain like it was part of his filing system. That was when something in me broke. The kind of break that doesn't hurt, it releases. I stood up, placed the recorder on the floor, and stared at it. For years, I'd been careful not to break anything. Careful not to make noise. Careful not to exist too loudly. And now, all I wanted was to hear something shatter. So I lifted my foot and brought it down hard. Once, twice, until the plastic cracked and the reels spilled out like dark ribbons across the carpet. The sound it made wasn't loud, but it was final. I picked up one of the tapes, snapped it in half, and felt a strange calm wash over me. Each time the plastic split, I felt lighter. Piece by piece, I destroyed his archive, his version of me. The woman he had recorded crying was gone. The one standing there was silent, steady, alive. When I finished, I swept the broken pieces into a trash bag, carried it outside, and threw it into the bin. The air outside was cool, the sky pale with evening light. For the first time in decades, I filled my lungs without fear of who might be listening. That night, I slept in his bed, my bed now, with the windows open. The wind moved through the curtains, and the house, usually so still, made soft sounds of its own. The floors creaked, the trees rustled, the night insects sang. It wasn't silence anymore. It was life. Lying there, I realized something simple and terrifying. Freedom doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, it begins with the sound of something breaking. And that night, for the first time in my life, the sound of breaking didn't scare me. It felt holy. The morning after breaking the tapes, I woke before dawn. The house was unnaturally quiet, as if even the walls were waiting to see what I'd do next. For years, my mornings had started with Henry's footsteps, his voice reminding me what needed doing. Without that routine, the silence felt wide and strange, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the empty chair across from me. For the first time in 40 years, there was no one to ask permission from. No one to please. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. By 7:30, I'd made up my mind. I took a shower, put on my navy dress, the one Henry always said was too loud because of its floral print, and brushed my hair with more care than I had in years. In the mirror, I didn't look like a widow. I looked like someone preparing for something important. I got in the car, the same beige sedan Henry had chosen for me because it was practical. The air smelled faintly of his cologne. I rolled the windows down and let the wind clear it out. The drive to downtown Savannah was a blur of sunlight and nervous resolve. I parked in front of the courthouse, a place I'd only been twice before, once to get our marriage license, and once years later when Henry was appointed to some committee. Both times, I'd stood beside him like a piece of furniture. Today, I walked through those doors alone. At the reception desk, a young woman in a gray blazer smiled politely. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Yes," I said, setting my purse down with deliberate calm. "I'd like to speak to whoever handled the notarization for my husband's estate." She typed something, then looked up. "Mrs. Carter, correct? I'm sorry for your loss." I nodded once. "Thank you. Is Mr. Reynolds available?" She disappeared for a moment and returned with a man in his 50s, balding, kind-eyed. "Mrs. Carter," he said, shaking my hand. "I didn't expect to see you so soon. Everything's already been processed according to your husband's directives." "That's why I'm here," I replied evenly. "I want to make changes. Effective immediately." He blinked. "Changes?" "Yes. The house, the pension, the car. I want them all transferred into my name only." His brows rose slightly. "That's already the case, legally speaking. As surviving spouse, you—" "No," I said, cutting him off. "Not shared. Not under his trust or his conditions. Mine." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Carter, are you certain you want to make such a formal declaration?" "It's unusual." "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm sure." He studied me for a moment, perhaps expecting tears or confusion. But there were none. I'd done my crying long before he died. After a pause, he nodded. "Very well. I'll prepare the paperwork." When I signed my name on the final page, my hands didn't shake. The pen moved steadily, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The clerk notarized the documents, stamped them with a heavy thud, and slid them toward me. "All set, Mrs. Carter." Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter. The air smelled sharper, fresher. The morning sun fell across the marble steps, and for once, I didn't hurry down them. I took my time. That afternoon, I stopped by the florist. Not for lilies, not for mourning. I bought sunflowers. Bright, unapologetic sunflowers. Henry had always called them gaudy. I set them in a vase on the dining table when I got home, and for the first time, that room looked like it belonged to someone living. Word traveled fast in Savannah. By evening, my phone rang twice, once from a woman at church and once from a neighbor. Both conversations began with condolences and ended with awkward silences after I told them I was doing just fine. People wanted grief they could comfort, not peace they couldn't understand. Some said I was bitter. Others said I'd lost my mind. Maybe both were true, but it didn't matter. For decades, I had lived by Henry's definitions of love, duty, respect, even sanity. Now I was finally free to define things for myself. That night, as the sun dipped low, I went room to room and opened every window. The air rushed in like a baptism, scattering the dust, fluttering the curtains he'd kept drawn for years. The wind carried the scent of magnolia and rain. I stood in the middle of the living room and breathed deeply, letting it wash over me. For years, I had kept the house spotless but airless, just the way he liked it. Now, it was alive with sound. The creak of the floors, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant hum of traffic. I didn't turn on the radio or the television. I didn't need to fill the space anymore. Silence no longer frightened me. It was finally mine. The wind stirred in response, gentle and cool against my face. For the first time in 40 years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt like it was exhaling after a long, suffocating silence. And standing there, barefoot on the hardwood floor, I realized that freedom doesn't always come from running away. Sometimes, it comes from standing exactly where you've been imprisoned, and refusing to be afraid of the air anymore. It's been 3 years now. The house no longer feels like his, it's mine in every color, every sound. I painted it yellow last spring, the kind of warm, defiant yellow Henry would have called tacky. The neighbors were polite about it, but I could see the raised eyebrows. I didn't care. Every brushstroke felt like reclaiming space I'd been denied. The yard is full of roses, red, white, even wild pink ones. He hated roses, said they were too messy. That's exactly why I planted them. They spill over the fence now, stubborn and alive, blooming without permission. Twice a week, I teach art at the local community center. Mostly women my age, some younger, a few older. They come in carrying more than sketchbooks, grief, loneliness, disappointment. Sometimes they bring cookies, sometimes stories that crack in their throats. I tell them both are healing. We paint small things at first, fruit, flowers, the sky at sunset, but what we're really painting is proof that we're still here. Evan visits when he can. He's kind, but there's distance in him. He still speaks of his father with respect, the way sons are taught to. One evening, over dinner, he asked, "Mom, why talk about it now? What's the point?" I looked at him, my grown boy who had once flinched at the sound of his father's voice. "Because," I said softly, "silence kept me his prisoner. Words set me free." He didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes lowered, maybe realizing for the first time that the mother he thought he knew had been fighting her own quiet war. People still speak of Henry as a good man. They tell stories about his generosity, his leadership. I don't correct them anymore. I simply smile. They can keep their version of him, I've made peace with mine. Because truth doesn't need their approval. It just needs air, and after all these years, I'm finally breathing it. The last word I spent 40 years surviving someone else's story. Now, I'm writing mine, in ink that doesn't wash off with tears. If you're reading this and you've ever hidden your pain behind a polite smile, speak. Before it's too late. Before the silence becomes your inheritance. Tell me, have you ever kept quiet just to keep the peace? Follow if you believe that peace without truth isn't peace at all. Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories.